YouTube, what's the word? It's your boy Rongloo. We back with another video. Today's video, we finna be reacting to Harvey, the storm that changed Texas forever. We finna react to another natural disaster, another video about natural disasters, man. You know, I see y'all kind of enjoyed the last video about the the tornadoes and shit and all that. So we finna keep these reactions coming, man. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you're new. Let's do it.
9:47 a.m. Inside a subdivision called Kellywood, families 3 miles downstream from the Barker Reservoir were eating breakfast in homes they'd been promised would never flood. The skies had cleared. The rain had stopped. Kids were watching television in dry living rooms while their parents checked weather apps that showed the worst had passed. What none of them knew was that at that exact moment, Army Corps engineers were making a calculation. The reservoir was holding more water than it was designed to contain. The dam wasn't failing yet, but if the rain returned, it would. They had one option left: open the gates and flood thousands of homes on purpose, or wait and risk an uncontrolled collapse that would flood tens of thousands.
Damn,
at 9:51,
that's a crazy ultimatum. That's a crazy ass ultimatum, bro. Flood thousands of homes willingly, or wait and risk it and it potentially be more than 10,000 homes. That's crazy, bro. My camera just focused. Don't focus. That's crazy, man. That's a crazy ultimatum. But yeah, man, that's a crazy ultimatum, man.
a.m., they started releasing the water. It was coming downstream, and nobody had called to warn them. Hurricane Harvey made landfall near Rockport, Texas, as a Category 4 hurricane with winds near 130 miles per hour. It tore roofs off concrete buildings along the coast and shredded entire neighborhoods into splinters.
Dang.
But the wind wasn't what made Harvey catastrophic. Within hours of landfall, the storm weakened and stalled over the Houston metro area. It sat there for 4 days. Meteorologists had predicted this. They knew a weak steering current would trap the storm over the most populated region of Texas. What they didn't predict was how much water it would drop. Forecast models called for heavy rain. They did not call for 50 inches. They did not call for 60. In some places, rain fell at rates of 6 inches per hour. That's faster than most drainage systems can move water, even when they're working perfectly. Houston's drainage system was not working perfectly. It had been designed in the 1940s and 50s using rainfall data that assumed storms like this happened once every 1,000 years, maybe never. Harvey was rewriting the data in real time. By August 26th, the bayous were rising. Buffalo Bayou, Brays Bayou, White Oak Bayou, all the channels that snake through Houston like veins started swelling past their banks. Water crept into neighborhoods that had been built in floodplains, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that water also crept into neighborhoods that weren't supposed to be floodplains. Homes that had never flooded, not during Tropical Storm Allison in 2001, not during the Tax Day flood in 2016, were taking on water. People who had been told they didn't need flood insurance because they lived outside the 100-year flood zone were watching water pour under their doors. The flood maps that defined safe from unsafe, insurable from uninsurable, were wrong. They weren't just a little wrong. They were so wrong that 75% of the homes that flooded during Harvey were outside the mapped flood zones. 75%. That's not a rounding error. That's a systemic failure in how Texas understood risk. On August 27th, the rain slowed. For a few hours, it looked like the worst might be over. Water levels stabilized in some bayous. Rescue crews started reaching people who'd been trapped overnight. There was relief on people's faces in the news footage. They thought they'd survived it. They hadn't. 40 miles northwest of downtown Houston, the Addicks and Barker reservoirs were filling faster than they ever had. These reservoirs are not lakes. They're dry detention basins, empty fields designed to catch floodwater during storms and release it slowly afterward. They were built in the 1940s after a catastrophic flood in 1935 killed 10 people and drowned downtown Houston under 12 feet of water. The reservoirs worked exactly as designed for 70 years. During Harvey, they filled past their design capacity. Engineers watched the water climb toward the tops of the dams. If it went over, the dams could fail. An uncontrolled failure would send a wall of water through West Houston, possibly killing thousands. The Army Corps of Engineers had a choice, and it wasn't a good one. They could open the floodgates and deliberately flood the neighborhoods directly downstream, or they could wait and hope the rain didn't come back. If they waited and the dams failed, the destruction would be exponentially worse. If they opened the gates, they would be intentionally destroying homes that were dry, homes where people were still living, homes where families had just started to believe they were safe. On the morning of August 28th, they made the decision. They opened the gates. Water began pouring out of the reservoirs at thousands of cubic feet per second, rushing down channels toward neighborhoods that had been built, right in the path decades earlier. Some of those neighborhoods were inside the reservoir pools themselves. Houses had been built in areas that were explicitly designed to flood. Developers had sold them anyway. Buyers had purchased them anyway. Everyone had assumed the reservoirs would never actually fill. The water reached the first homes within hours. Families who had spent the weekend dry, who had watched the flooding on the news and felt grateful it wasn't them.
That's crazy, bro. I ain't gonna lie, bro. A hurricane ain't shit but a tornado with water. But I don't know, man. It's like, damn, tornadoes and hurricanes, it's two of the worst natural disasters, man. For real.
Only had water pouring into their living rooms. It wasn't rain. It was a controlled release, a deliberate flood to save the dam. Evacuation orders went out, but by then some streets were already impassable. Boats appeared in subdivisions where boats had never been. People carried children to second floors. Some families climbed into attics. The water kept rising. It rose for days. By the time it peaked, more than 10,000 homes downstream of the reservoirs were underwater. Many of them would stay underwater for 2 weeks. When the water finally drained, the furniture was ruined, the walls were growing mold, and the air smelled like sewage and chemicals. Insurance adjusters started showing up. That's when people found out most of them had no coverage. Flood insurance was optional if you lived outside the flood zone, and the maps had said they were outside the flood zone. Stories like this are why I built Stormforge. If you want more real disaster breakdowns like this, consider subscribing. Now back to what happened next. Across the Houston metro area, more than 300,000 structures flooded during Harvey. The majority were homes. People lost everything. Photo albums, furniture, cars, documents, the physical anchors of their lives. But they also lost something less tangible. They lost the belief that the maps meant something. For decades, FEMA's flood maps had divided Houston into zones. If you were in the special flood hazard area, the 100-year floodplain, you needed flood insurance and your home had to be elevated. If you were outside it, you were considered safe.
Right.
That framework collapsed during Harvey.
Damn.
The flood didn't respect the lines on the map. It went where the water went, and the water went everywhere the land was low and the rain was heavy. The problem wasn't just that the maps were outdated. The problem was that they'd been built on assumptions that were no longer true. They assumed rainfall patterns from the mid-20th century. They assumed drainage infrastructure that was adequately maintained. They assumed a level of development and impervious surface cover that no longer existed. Houston had paved over wetlands, filled in prairies, and covered hundreds of square miles in concrete and asphalt. All that pavement meant water couldn't soak into the ground. It had to go somewhere else. It went into homes. In the months after Harvey, engineers and hydrologists started analyzing what had gone wrong. They found that Harvey's rainfall exceeded even the most extreme projections in NOAA's updated Atlas 14 precipitation data, which had only recently been published for Texas. Atlas 14 showed that extreme rainfall events were significantly more intense than engineers had previously assumed. A 24-hour storm that used to be expected once every 100 years was now expected to drop 30 to 50% more rain. Many counties, including Harris County, hadn't yet updated their infrastructure design standards to match the new data. They were still building drainage systems for storms that didn't exist anymore. Harvey proved the new data wasn't pessimistic. If anything, it was still conservative. Some areas received rainfall totals that exceeded the Atlas 14 500-year event. That's supposed to be a 0.02% chance in any given year. It happened. Here's where I want to hear from you. Knowing what you know now, should people have been allowed to build homes inside the reservoir pools? Let me know in the comments.
Hell
The
no.
death toll from Harvey and
Hell no. They should never ever did that. That was the dumbest shit they could have did, man. Like, if they knew the risk of people could possibly getting their home flooded and losing their home and a fatality or a casualty, they should never sold or built them homes, man. For real.
Texas was 68 people directly, with dozens more indirect deaths from the aftermath. That number is lower than it could have been, partly because Houston did not order a mass evacuation. Mayor Sylvester Turner made that call based on what happened during Hurricane Rita in 2005, when a panicked evacuation killed more than 100 people in traffic jams and heat exhaustion before the storm even arrived.
Damn.
Turner decided the risk of flooding was lower than the risk of putting millions of people on the highways in August heat with nowhere to go. He was probably right, but the decision meant people were still in their homes when the water came. The Coast Guard, the National Guard, and volunteers from Louisiana, called the Cajun Navy, conducted more than 17,000 water rescues. Helicopters pulled people off rooftops. Boats navigated through living rooms. People were plucked from trees, from cars, from attics where they'd gone to escape rising water. Some didn't make it. 3 children died when their family's van was swept off the road in Beaumont. A woman died when she drove into floodwater she couldn't see in the dark. An elderly man drowned in his apartment. These were not people who made reckless choices. They were people who lived in places they'd been told were safe, who followed the rules, who trusted the maps. After the water receded, the politics started. FEMA distributed billions in disaster aid. The Texas General Land Office began administering federal buyout money, offering to purchase flooded homes and convert them to green space so they could never be developed again. It was the largest buyout program in Texas history. More than 13,000 homes were eventually bought out, entire streets erased from the map. The idea was simple: stop rebuilding in places that are going to flood again. But the program faced immediate criticism. It was slow. It was uneven. Some neighborhoods were offered buyouts while others weren't. Wealthier areas sometimes received flood control infrastructure improvements while poorer areas were bought out and bulldozed. Environmental justice advocates pointed out that the burden of retreating from flood risk was falling disproportionately on communities of color and low-income residents. The buyouts were voluntary, but when your home is destroyed and you can't afford to rebuild and you can't sell it to anyone else, voluntary starts to feel like a technicality. Harris County voters approved a $2.5 billion bond in 2018 to fund flood control projects, widening bayous, building detention basins, upgrading drainage infrastructure. It was the largest local flood control investment in the county's history, but even $2.5 billion wasn't enough to protect everyone. Engineers had to prioritize. They focused on areas with repetitive losses, places that flooded over and over. That meant some neighborhoods that flooded during Harvey but hadn't flooded before were lower priority. The message was clear. Harvey wasn't a one-time event. It was the new reference point. Everything would now be measured against Harvey. Was your drainage system adequate for a Harvey-level storm? Was your home elevated above Harvey flood levels? Could your neighborhood survive another Harvey? The answer, for much of Houston, was no. The reservoir releases triggered a wave of lawsuits. Property owners whose homes were deliberately flooded sued the federal government, arguing that the intentional flooding constituted a taking of private property under the Fifth Amendment. The legal battle went on for years. In 2019, a federal judge ruled in favor of the property owners, finding that the government was liable for damages. The ruling established that when the government knowingly floods private property to protect public infrastructure, it owes compensation.
Exactly.
But the ruling didn't
they
change
can't do that. Like, y'all gotta owe some type of money or something, even though it was a ultimatum and a risk. It was a big risk. Y'all still owe them people, man.
The fact that the same decision would probably be made again in the same situation. The dams had to be protected. The calculus was brutal but simple. Flood 10,000 homes or risk an uncontrolled failure that could flood 100,000. The people downstream paid the price for a problem that was decades in the making. Texas also changed how it thinks about flood risk. The term 100-year flood started disappearing from official communications because people misunderstood it. They thought it meant a flood that happens once every 100 years, so if it just happened, they were safe for another century. That's not what it means. It means a 1% chance every single year. You can have 200-year floods in the same decade. You can have risk in terms of annual percentage chance and started using updated climate data that acknowledged rainfall intensity was increasing. Some counties began requiring new homes to be elevated above the 500-year flood level, not the 100-year level. Developers complained the regulations would make housing unaffordable. Flood control advocates said building in flood-prone areas at all was the problem. The tension remains unresolved. Harvey also changed the insurance market. Flood insurance enrollment increased significantly in the years after the storm, but it's still far below what actuaries say it should be. Many people couldn't afford the premiums. Others assumed it wouldn't happen again in their lifetime. Private insurers started entering the flood market, offering alternatives to the National Flood Insurance Program. But they also started pulling out of other lines of coverage in Texas. For watching this one, it's not an easy story, but these are the disasters that change how we build and where we live. The next video breaks down what happened when a town ignored every warning sign before.
That's crazy, man. Hey, WB it, man. WB it, man. These hurricanes, these tornadoes ain't shit to play with, man. For real. Y'all stay prayed up out here, man.